Welcome to session 82 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. The works that we're looking at today are from this trilogy, Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance by Jeff Vandermeer, typically called the Southern Reach trilogy for reasons that we'll talk about in just a few moments. And one thing that's very unusual about this particular trilogy, you notice, we've got a thinner volume to start and then two thicker volumes. They all come out in the same, not just time frame, the same year, 2014, just 10 years ago, one right after the other. They're being written in quick succession. And so as opposed to some other series where it's stretched out over a decade or even longer, this stuff is all in the author's mind at the same time, as we'll talk about, again, something we'll get to a bit later. So how to describe these: science fiction, spy stuff, weird. There's a lot of different ways to categorize these, and we'll talk about what genre they perhaps best fit under as well. But for anybody who's tuning in and who's new to this, we should explain what Worlds of Speculative Fiction is. This is a series that started back in 2016. It was originally an in-person series, and we would record with a camera so people all over the world could, in a certain way, partake and participate, even though they couldn't be there for the actual session. And it was hosted at a local library here in the greater Milwaukee area called the Brookfield Public Library. So we did that for a number of years until we hit the COVID lockdown, and then that threw quite a wrench into the series as well as many other parts of our lives. And what I decided to do was change the format, and so it's what you see today. I record a video anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes long, where I'll go deep into the text, maybe do some biography of the author, look at some of the things that they've said about their works, what other people have said when they're germane. The emphasis is on two main, you could say, complementary themes. World building, so we're always looking at stories, novels, series that have some sort of narrative universe for us to explore, and then philosophical themes, and these often go hand in hand with each other. So that's what we're going to be exploring in this for the next however minutes in this video. As it premieres, people can engage in live chat, and I'll answer and address any comments or questions that people have. Then typically we have a more interactive video conferencing session using Zoom. Now, if you're seeing this video after it has already premiered, that doesn't mean that you can't be involved. Of course, you can leave comments and put down your own thoughts about the works or the things that we're going to discuss in this session. So we got a lot of really cool stuff lined up. I will say, just to begin this, that these are an interesting read. You could, I think for some people they may be very quick and easy. I found myself having to kind of work at it, but it was rewarding to do so. And a good bit of the time, you're not quite sure what exactly is happening. And maybe even at the end, you're not 100% sure about it either. But you get the sense it's something pretty big. So on that, we'll now jump into looking at a bit of the world building, and then we'll talk about some of these other matters that I've brought up. Since this is Worlds of Speculative Fiction, we should start perhaps by talking about the world building that goes into these three novels. And let's also talk about the plotting, the characters, the structure of them. So you notice that we've got this quite short annihilation. And why annihilation? Because what we see is an expedition going into Area X, which we'll talk about in a moment, and it's a failure like all of the previous exhibitions, in that what happens in Area X eventually ends up either killing or changing the people involved, including the main character, the biologist, who's giving us an account here. Then we get introduced to other figures, other characters in the much longer authority, and we go outside Area X into the Southern Reach and also other parts of America. So we get this character Control, who is now, since the previous director went on an expedition and didn't come back from it, now going to take over. And the Southern Reach has been sending expeditions into Area X now for decades without much success of any sort, not being able to get their heads around the mystery, generating data, but the data doesn't seem to be all that helpful, and losing personnel in the process. So this new director is inheriting a situation that's already quite broken down, messed up. And we also get some glimpses of places outside of the Southern Reach specifically. And then we have Acceptance. And, the titles are meaningful. There is a sort of getting to the bottom, at least a bottom, perhaps a false bottom, of some of the mysteries involved in this, and an acceptance of their fate, their condition on the part of the characters. And we're going to get introduced to quite a few other characters. Grace, the assistant to the director, plays a major role as sort of an antagonist in Authority and as a character in Acceptance. The biologist, or at least a version of the biologist, who goes by the name Ghost Bird, plays a role in Acceptance and Authority. We're introduced to other people as well. Saul, the lighthouse keeper. We learn about the previous director when she was a little girl, and there's all sorts of other characters involved as well. So let's launch right in. I've got a lot of passages marked that I'd like to sort of bring your attention to, but we have to talk about Area X. So what is Area X? It's an unknown. Something has happened there, and nobody knows why or even what it is, but there's a border between it and what we might consider our real world, and the Southern Reach is on the very end of that. We're actually going to get a glimpse of the border in one of the passages that we're looking at, an Army Border Command. And they've been trying to figure out what's going on here as the phenomenon seems to be spreading, expanding, because is it a threat to our existence, our world? We're not really sure. And I'm going to begin with a passage from deep in Acceptance, which is coming from one of the older persons, Whitby. And Whitby is kind of a damaged individual. He was in on an expedition. And so this is Control. And Control is thinking to himself, and he calls forth a passage from the pages of Whitby where the man almost waxed poetic. So here's an interpretation of what's happening in Area X. Area X has been created by an organism left behind by a civilization so advanced and so ancient and so alien to us and to our own intent and our own thought processes that it has long since left us behind, left everything behind. And, he's considering what does this actually mean? And that, is that a definitive interpretation of what's going on in Area X? It's an interesting one. It's plausible, but we don't really know. It's Whitby's conjecture, and Control seems to think that there's something to this. So let's start at the start in Annihilation, and we find that they are going to be sent in, and we read about the tower, which was not supposed to be there, plunging into the earth in a place just before the black pine forest gives way to swamp, and then the reeds and wind-gnarled trees of the marsh flats. Beyond the marsh flats and the natural canals lies the ocean, and a bit further down the coast a derelict lighthouse. All of this part of the country had been abandoned for decades for reasons that are not easy to relate. Our expedition was the first to enter Area X for more than 2 years, and much of our predecessors' equipment had rusted, their tents and sheds little more than husks. And we read, there were 4 of us, a biologist, an anthropologist, a surveyor, and a psychologist. I was the biologist. All of us were women this time, chosen as a part of the complex set of variables that governed sending the expeditions. The psychologist, who is older than the rest of us, served as the expedition's leader. She had put us all under hypnosis to cross the border to make sure we remained calm. It took 4 days of hard hiking after crossing the border to reach the coast. Our mission was simple: to continue the government's investigation into the mysteries of Area X, slowly working our way out from the base camp. The expedition could last days, months, even years, depending on various stimuli and conditions. We had supplies with us for 6 months. Another 2 years' worth of supplies had been stored at the base camp. We had also been assured it was safe to live off the land if necessary. Our most outlandish equipment consisted of a measuring device that had been issued to us, which hung from a strap on our belts. Here we go. A small rectangle of black metal with a glass-covered hole in the middle. If the hole glowed red, we had 30 minutes to remove ourselves to a, quote, safe place. We were not told what the device measured or why we should be afraid should it glow red. And so, they're off on a mission. It's not quite clear, other than observe, figure out what's going on here, figure out patterns. And they don't really know each other. And you notice that they've been placed under hypnosis. That's going to play an important role in all of these books as we go on. So, a little bit later in this, we read, according to the records we'd been shown, the first expedition reported nothing unusual in Area X, just pristine, empty wilderness. After the second and third exhibitions did not return and their fate became known, the expeditions were shut down for a time. When they began again, it was using carefully chosen volunteers who might at least know a measure of the full risk. Since then, some expeditions had been more successful than others. The 11th expedition in particular had been difficult, and personally difficult for me with regard to a fact about which I have not been entirely honest so far. So this is the biologist telling us in her journal about why it was important for her to be on the 12th expedition. My husband was on the 11th expedition as a medic. He'd never wanted to be a doctor, always wanted to be in first response or working in trauma. He had been recruited for Area X by a friend who remembered him from when they'd both worked for the Navy before he switched over to ambulance service. At first he hadn't said yes, had been unsure, but over time they convinced him. It caused a lot of strife between us, although we already had many difficulties. And she goes on, I know this information might not be hard for anyone to find out, but I've hoped that in reading this account, you might find me a credible, objective witness, not someone who had volunteered for Area X because of some other event unconnected to the purpose of the expeditions. And in a sense, this is still true, and my husband's status as member of an expedition is in many ways irrelevant to why I signed up. But how could I not be affected by Area X if only through him? So we're going to come back to that in a bit. A little bit later, we find out that there's a map. And here we start to see that Area X it's not so simple as Area X is being checked out by a government agency who has, the best intentions in mind and is transparent with its people, except where national security dictates elsewise. She writes, the map had been the first form of misdirection. For what was a map but a way of emphasizing some things and making other things invisible? Always we were directed to the map, to memorizing the details on the map. Our instructor, who remained nameless to us, drilled us for 6 long months on the position of the lighthouse relative to the base camp, the number of miles from one ruined patch of houses to another, the number of miles of coastline we would be expected to explore, always in the context of the lighthouse, not the base camp. We became so comfortable with that map, with the dimensions of it, and the thought of what it contained, it stopped us from asking why, or even what. Why this stretch of coast? What might lie inside the lighthouse? Why was the camp set back in the forest, far from the lighthouse, but fairly close to the tower, which of course did not exist on the map? And had the base camp always been there? What lay beyond the map? Now that I knew the extent of the hypnotic suggestion that had been used on us, I realized that the focus on the map might have itself been an embedded clue. That if we did not ask questions, it was because we were programmed not to ask questions. That the lighthouse, representative or actual, might have been a subconscious trigger for a hypnotic suggestion, and that it might have also been the epicenter of whatever had spread out to become Area X. She writes, my briefing on the ecology of that place had a similar blinkered focus. I'd spent most of my time becoming familiar with the natural transitional ecosystems of the flora and the fauna and the cross-pollination I could expect to find. But I'd also had an intense refresher on fungi and lichen that, in light of the words on the wall, which we're going to look at much later, now stood out in my mind as being the true purpose of all that study. If the map had been meant solely to distract, then the ecology research had been meant, after all, to truly prepare me, unless I was being paranoid. But if I wasn't, it meant that they knew about the tower, perhaps had always known about the tower. From there, my suspicions grew. They'd put us through grueling survival and weapons training, so grueling that most evenings we went right to sleep in our separate quarters. Even on those few occasions when we trained together, we were training apart. They took away our names in the second month, stripped them from us. The only names applied to things in Area X, and only in terms of their most general label. This, too, a kind of distraction from asking certain questions that could only be reached through knowing specific details. But the right specific details, not, for example, that there were 6 species of venomous snakes in Area X, a reach. Yes, but I was not in the mood to set aside even the most unlikely scenarios. By the time we were ready to cross the border, we knew everything and we knew nothing. So, a lot of interesting reflections on what's going on in Area X and with this government agency. This is part of our world that we're exploring. And in Authority, we have not Area X, but the Southern Reach being taken over by Control. Well, sort of taken over. Is it easy to take over an agency that has been around long before you? No. And so we get an interesting account here, right? We've got Control talking, well, essentially third person finding out about things. He hadn't been told he'd spent his first day questioning disoriented returnees from Area X, and yet Central, higher up than him, must have known when he'd been offered the position. The expedition members had been picked up 6 weeks ago, subjected to a month of tests at a processing station up north before being sent to the Southern Reach, just as he'd been sent to Central first to endure 2 weeks of briefings, including gaps, whole days that slid into oblivion without much of anything happening, as if they'd meant to time it this way. Then everything had been sped up, and he'd been given the impression of urgency. And we find out that the voice, his primary contact in the upper echelons, had implied in an initial briefing this was an easy assignment given his past history. The Southern Reach had become a backwater agency guarding a dormant secret no one seemed to care about much anymore, given the focus on terrorism and ecological collapse. The Voice had, in its gruff way, typified his mission to start as being brought in to acclimate, assess, analyze, and then dig in deep, which wasn't his usual brief these days. And we read, during an admittedly up-and-down career, Control had started as an operative in the field, surveillance on domestic terror cells, then he'd been bumped up to data synthesis and organizational analysis, cases invisible to the public, the secret history of nothing. More and more he'd become the fixer because he'd become better at identifying other people's specific problems than in managing his own general ones. At 38, that was what he'd become known for if he was known for anything. It meant you didn't have to be there for the duration, even though by now that's exactly what he wanted, to see something through. The Voice, we read a little further, it also neglected to mention that Area X lay beyond a border that still, after more than 30 years, no one seemed to understand. No, he'd only picked up on that when reviewing the files and in the needless replication from the orientation video. Nor had he known the assistant director would hate him so much for replacing the missing director. All right? So we've got some very interesting stage setting there outside of Area X, but completely determined by it. We get an interesting meeting going on a little bit later on with Control, Whitby, Grace, and the staff linguist all involved in it. They were huddled around the world's smallest conference table stool on which Control had placed the pot with the plant and mouse, everything in its time and place. Although the director's cell phone would not be part of the conversation, Grace had already confiscated it. "What is this?" he said, pointing to the wall of words. "In my office." Not quite willing to concede the unspoken point that continued to radiate from Grace like a force field, it was still the former director's office. This included not just the words, but the crude map of Area X drawn beneath the words in green, red, and black, showing the usual landmarks: lighthouse, topographical anomaly, that is the tower, base camp, and also further up the coast, the island. A few stray words had been scribbled with a ballpoint pen out to the sides, incomprehensible. Then there were two rather daunting slash marks about half a foot above Control's head with dates about 3 years apart, one red, one green. Grace says, "I thought you'd read all the files." Nothing in the files had mentioned a door's worth of peculiar text, but he wouldn't argue the point. So he says, "Humor me." "The director wrote it," Grace said. "These are words found written on the walls of the tunnel." "But why did you leave it here?" For an intense moment, the words and rotting honey smell combined to make him feel physically ill. "A memorial," Whitby said quickly as to provide an excuse for the assistant director. "It seemed too disrespectful to take it down." "Not a memorial," Grace said. "It's not a memorial because the director isn't dead. I don't believe she's dead." "What does it mean?" Control asked to move past the moment. "That's why we brought the linguist," Whitby said charitably, even though it was clear that Shu's presence had surprised the assistant director. But Shu had never had ever more influence as the Southern Reach shrank. Soon enough, they might have a situation where sub-departments consisted of one person writing themselves up for offenses, giving themselves raises and bonuses, celebrating their own birthdays with custom-made Southern Reach-shaped carrot cakes. Then we read, "First of all, we're 99.9% certain this text is by the lighthouse keeper, Saul Evans." And I'm going to leave that there because we're going to come back to that. What else do we read? Well, as they approach the border, we get an interesting description. Glimpses of towns now under kudzu and other vines moldering in the moss. Long abandoned miniature golf course with a pirate theme. The golf greens had been buried in leaves and mud. The half decks of Corsair ships rose at crazy angles as if from choppy seas of vegetation massed, cracked at right angles and disappearing into the gloom. A crumbling gas station lay next door, the roof caved in by fallen trees, the pavement so cracked by gnarled roots it had crumbled into water-ripe pieces with the seeming texture and consistency of moist brownies. The fuzzy, irregular shapes of houses and two-story buildings through the trees proved that people had lived here before the evacuation. This close to the border, as little as possible was disturbed, and so these abandoned places could only be broken down by the natural processes of rain and decay. According to a labyrinthine hierarchical church, the Southern Reach was under the Army's jurisdiction here, which might be why the Southern Reach facility, closed down between exhibitions, looked like a bit of a row of large tents that had been made of lemon meringue, which is to say it looked like any number of churches Control had become familiar with in his teenage year, usually because of whatever girl he was dating. These are revival tents, right? And Army HQ was in a dome-shaped section of the barracks after the final checkpoint, but nobody seemed to be around except a few privates standing in the churned mud bath that was the unofficial parking lot, right? And so we find out that the border is being patrolled, but this is sort of like being stationed in the middle of nowhere to these military people. We learn a little bit more about the control person, that he was part of a operation that went bad. And I actually won't read all of this, but it's interesting that we find that he's got a bad back history that Grace knows about. And then a little bit later in the work, you heard me mention the voice earlier. So Control is reporting into the voice. And so, for example, here we go. He'd reviewed the surveillance of his Wednesday and Thursday conversations with the voice on Friday night after a vigorous jog. He'd been suspicious, hadn't trusted the way he'd seemed to fade in and out of those conversations or how the voice had infiltrated his thought. Control had seen the voice execute hypnotic commands, seen himself become unfocused, head floating a bit on his neck, eyelids fluttering, while the voice, never dropping the metallic guttural disguise, gave him orders and suggestions, right? And so the voice, while Control languished under hypnosis, had a sharpness and focus not as present otherwise, and a kind of casual perversity telling Control she wanted a joke to end their next phone call, one with a punchline. As far as he could tell, he'd also been serving as a living tape recorder for this voice. The voice pulled out of Control verbatim conversations, which explained why he'd been so late getting home Wednesday, even though the conversation had seemed short. He'd been on an exhibition sent into the Southern Reach, and just like the expeditions into Area X, not told the truth. He'd been right to feel that he was getting information, coming in with an extra stutter step. What else had he done that he might not know? And so here, he takes a bit of agency for himself. He'd written on the neon orange sheet that he could not possibly miss, "Control, you are being subjected to hypnotic suggestion by the voice. Check this line and scream obscenities, move down one line. Check this line and scream obscenities, move down one line. Rinse, repeat, brought out of it by the bullhorn, pulled back into it, until finally he reached the end. Check this line and repeat these phrases." All the phrases he'd found in the director's desk. Shout them, actually. Are you excited too? The possibility of significant variation. Paralysis is not a cogent analysis. Consolidation of authority. There's no reward in the risk. Floating and floating like nothing human, but something free and floating. Overload the system as the scientists with the white rabbits had been unable to. Push the voice into some kind of collapse. So, he's going to free himself to some degree of this hypnotic control. Then the last one that I want to bring up, Grace and Control are talking, and Grace says you have to understand the director's position. The first expedition had set the tone within the organization, even though the original director, by the time Cynthia had gotten here, was trying to change that. Cynthia? For a moment, Control wondered who Cynthia was because he thought of her as the director for so long. The personnel here felt that the first expedition failed because the Southern Reach did not know what it was doing, that we'd sent them in and they died because we did not know what we were doing, and we could never really make up for that. The first expedition, a sacrifice to a lack of context, a lament unrecognized as such until it was too late. And Lowry's presence here at the agency, from my understanding, only made that worse. He was a living ghost, a reminder held up as a hero when he had just been a survivor. So his advice was given more weight even when it was wrong. The director only really had a chance to pursue her own agenda after Lowry had been promoted to Central, even though that, too, was a problem. Lowry pushed for more expeditions, even though the director wanted fewer. And whereas before she could control Lowry, now he was beyond her control. So we kept sending people in, throwing them up against a complete unknown. This did not sit well with the director, although she followed orders because she had to. And then he asks, how did the director get her own agenda? In what ways? And Grace says, she became obsessed with metrics, with changing the context. If she could have her metrics, then Lowry could have his expeditions, the conditioning and hypnosis he championed. Although over time she came to understand why Lowry pushed the hypnosis. So we've got some really strange things happening, not just in Area X, but also in the Southern Reach. And now there's a few other passages from Acceptance that we should look to as well. So they are now in Area X, and there's a discussion going on between Control and Ghostbird, and he says, why all the focus on the lighthouse, the topographical anomaly, and not the island? Actually, that's just what she asks. And he says, you'd have to ask the former director about that, or you'd have to ask Lowry. And she says, I never met Lowry. And then Control says, truth is, Lowry sounded unreal when he said the name in his place. But Lowry also resisted being cast aside, disregarded, kept floating there at the edges of his vision like some majestic demonic dust mode. And then they go on. We think in terms of machines, not animals. The enemy doesn't acknowledge machines. He liked the word enemy. It crystallized and focused his attention more than Area X. Area X was just a phenomenon visited upon humanity like a weather event, but an enemy created intent and focus. She laughed at machines, not animals. It definitely understands and acknowledges machines. It understands them better than we do. Have you not understood yet that whatever's causing this can manipulate the genome, work miracles of mimicry and biology, knows what to do with molecules and membranes, can peer through things, can surveil and then withdraw? That two at a smartphone, say, is as basic as a flint arrowhead, that it's operating off such refined and intricate senses that the tools we've bound ourselves with, the ways we record the universe, are probably evidence of our own primitive nature. Perhaps it doesn't even think that we have consciousness or free will, not in the way that it measures such things. If that's true, then why does it pay us any attention at all? And then Ghostbird says, it probably extends us the least attention possible. So we give up. We live on the island. We make ourselves hats out of leaves, take bounty from the sea, build a house from the ribs of one of the leviathans from his dreams, listen to homemade dance music while drinking moonshine distilled from poisonous weeds, turn away from the real world because it doesn't exist anymore. Ignoring him, she said, a whale can injure another whale with its sonar. A whale can speak to another whale across 60 miles of ocean. A whale is as intelligent as we are, just in a way we can't quite measure or understand, because we're these incredibly blunt instruments. Or at least you are. And then he says, you sympathize with it. You like it. A cheap shot that he couldn't help. So that's a very interesting exchange there. A bit later on, we are going to read that there's an expedition that is going on, or exploration. Returned from my exploration with the owl as my companion. This is Ghostbird. I now slowly took the measure of my immediate surroundings, the lighthouse, the buildings around it, and the town behind. The town, which must have been abandoned long before the creation of Area X, consisted of a main street and a few side streets that had faded into impression of dirt roads. All of it empty. Main Street had become a kind of facade, having fallen into a disheveled army of vines and flowering trees and bushes and weeds and wildflowers. Here and there, I found more signs of expeditions that had reached the island and either gone back across the water or died here and been transformed here, as we're going to talk about transformation in a bit. An abandoned backpack with the usual map in it, a flashlight, a rifle scope, a water canteen. These were tantalizing remnants, indicators that I'd tried to read too much into. For reasons that revealed a weakness in me, it should have been enough to know others had come here first and that others had sought answers, whether they had found them or not. But there's sedimentary layers to this information, and some of the older materials, which I believed dated back to just before and right after the creation of Area X, interested me more. People had taken up residence here within the narrow spectrum, and those people went by the initials of S and SB, though I never found a fragment that told me what these initials stood for. Nor could I recall, either back in the world or during our training for the expedition, ever hearing of such an organization. Not, of course, that the island had been given any thought or attention in that training. By then, any betrayal by the Southern Reach struck me as just more of the same. Then a little bit later on, we have a very interesting exchange going on between Grace and Ghostbird. Right? So Ghostbird says, we're not on Earth. We can't be on Earth. Not with that much distortion of time. Not with the things the biologists saw. Not if they wanted to pretend that there were rules in place, even if the rules had been obscured, made unclear, withheld. But was that true, or had time just become irrational, inconsistent? Still, that reluctance and the distance it created between her and them, until Grace finally said, that was my conclusion. One of the theories put forward by the science division. Then Control says, a kind of wormhole. The limit of how far he could go, anything more would be pulled out of him by the brightness. A disbelieving stare from Grace. Do you think Area X builds spaceships too? Do you think Area X transverses interstellar space? Wormholes? Think of something more subtle. Something peering through what we think of as reality. Flat, clipped words, stripped of the awe that should have animated them. Because she'd had these extra 3 years, because she was thinking of loved ones back home. Control, so slowly, almost as if in a hypnotized state. Everything in Area X that we thought was degrading too rapidly, most of it was just getting old. And he says, some things were very old indeed, the remnants of the village and the various sedimentary layers of those journals. So much more time had passed in Area X after the border came down before the first expedition had gone in. People could have lived in Area X for much, much longer after the border came down than anyone had thought. How was this not known before, Control said. How was this not clear before? Corrupted data, Grace said. Skewed samples, incomplete information. She means, Ghostbird said, that so many expeditions came back disoriented, damaged, or not at all, that the SR had no reliable samples. She meant that the time dilation must be more severe when Area X shifted or underwent a change, and otherwise must be almost unmeasurable. So we get some really interesting things going on, and then towards the end of this conversation, Ghostbird says that's not the critical question, nor for organisms that are so masterful at camouflage. Then what is, Control says? The critical question, Grace said, is what is the purpose of this organism or organisms, and how do we survive? We know its purpose, Control said, which is to kill us, to transform us, to get rid of us. Isn't that what we try to avoid thinking about? What the director, you, pointing at Grace, and Shaney and all the rest had to keep suppressing? The thought that it just wants to kill us all? You think we didn't have these conversations 1,000 times, Grace said? You think we didn't go around and around trying to get out of circles? People make patterns all the time without realizing it, Ghostbird said. An organism can have a purpose and yet also make patterns that have little to do with that purpose. There's a lot of energy being generated and discharged. If the border is a kind of membrane, it could be a case of dumping it somewhere else. Think about how things disappear when they come in contact with the border. But they don't disappear, do they? Grace said. I don't think so. I think they get sent else somewhere. Where? Control said. Ghostbird shrugged, thinking of the journey into Area X and the devastation and destruction she'd seen. The ruined cities was that real membranes and dimensions, limitless amounts of space, limitless amounts of energy, effortless manipulation of molecules, continual attempts to transform the human into the non-human, the ability to move an entire biosphere to another place. Right now, if the outside world existed, it would still be sending radio wave messages into space and monitoring radio wave frequencies to seek out other intelligent life in the universe, but Ghostbird didn't think those messages were being recovered. Another way, people were bound by their own view of consciousness. What if an infection was a message, a brightness, a kind of symphony, as a defense, as an odd form of communication? If so, the message had not been received, probably never would be received. The message buried in the transformation itself, having to reach for such banal answers because of a lack of imagination, because human beings couldn't even put themselves into the mind of a cormorant or an owl or a whale or a bumblebee. So, no answers here. Lots of possible answers being suggested, but none of them given as definitive. And so we have Area X in which all these strange things are happening. There's clearly some intelligence, or perhaps even just a remnant of an intelligence that had created that intelligence, peering through and seeing things and occasionally doing things to the people that are trying to examine Area X. Then outside of it, the Southern Reach itself and our world being not protected by the Southern Reach because they don't know enough to actually protect us from whatever is in Area X. That is the narrative world, along with some of its important characters through whom the world is revealed, that we get in this Southern Reach trilogy. In the decades since the Southern Reach trilogy appeared, Jeff Vandermeer has given a lot of interviews, giving a lot of information to us, his readers, about what was going on in his mind and how he conceives of his work as a writer. And some of this goes beyond the Southern Reach trilogy, but a lot of it really has to focus on it and illuminates it for us. So I've put together, as I often do, a number of different excerpts from the interviews. I'll tell you where they are because you can find them linked to in the video description below, so you can track them down yourself and check them out. So with no further ado, let's start with the Book Riot interview, where he's asked, with the Southern Reach trilogy, you wrote all three of these novels in 1 year? And he says, not really. I wrote one novel that was, and the idea for the whole trilogy was bought after I did that. Then I had about 2 years to write the other novels, but I spent most of 1 year thinking about them and then wrote the second two in 1 year. And the distinction is important just because I had a day job since 2007, so I hadn't really written a lot of novels. I'd written one novel basically where I had all the time in the world to write it and had never been under deadline for something where I was writing full time. So prior novels I wrote at lunch, after dinner, things like that, and so I didn't actually know what my process was. And it turns out if I think about a novel for about a year and then have a year to write two novels set in the same year with the same characters, basically, it's not that big of a deal. I'm not saying it wasn't hard, but what I'm saying is that it didn't warp what I wanted to do with the books, if that makes any sense. Sometimes I feel weird about talking about the process because people think, oh, well, you wrote them so quickly. But they're exactly the way that I wanted them to be. So it's an interesting glimpse into the process of the conceptualization and research and writing. In Electric Lit, we get a little bit more about what's going on with the novels. You've talked in previous interviews about using the trilogy to create an expanding lens between annihilation and authority that's evident when you move outward from Area X to look at its impact on the community surrounding it. Was there a concern in returning to Area X and acceptance, you'd risk narrowing that lens again, or else be forced into a position of offering up too many direct answers to the mysteries you set up? So Vandermeer says, it would have been very easy to write 3 annihilations that each pushed forward the narrative to various answers, but not very interesting to write, and to some extent, cynical. I was more interested in giving readers something different with each novel and a different trilogy overall, too. So I did have some concerns about returning to Area X if I couldn't offer something different, but it seemed to me that the perspective taken allowed for a return that was a departure from what had gone before. I definitely wanted to get the ratio of remaining questions to answers given right. Too many direct answers would have undermined the inquiries at the heart of the novels, but too few would seem like a cheat. So interesting remark there about the ratio of questions to answers for the writer and for us readers. Going back on, so there are some direct answers and some that readers have to piece together. I will say that most everything is in there in acceptance, even if some is hidden a little bit. What I have to accept is that some readers will find too many answers and some readers too few. But that kind of comes with the territory in this case. Given the series is also exploring the idea of subjectivity and competing ideologies or narratives, that's probably appropriate. And so they go on and they say, it seems that a lot of what drives that complexity of that shifting lens is the way in which perspective floats with increasing readiness from book to book. How did the choice to shift perspectives in this way come about? So Vandermeer says, well, it was always implicit in the idea of a widening lens. I've never been a fan of repeating the same scenes from different character points of view, except in a very limited way, because I find that boring as a reader. But the idea of advancing the plot while also exploring how your perception of a person or character changes as a result of seeing them from different vantage points appealed quite a bit. The trick was to ensure that the character arcs by the end of acceptance were complete and satisfying. You don't want things just to seem to drift off into the ether. And then finally, another follow-up. To a great extent, it seems like Acceptance is a book that deals with memory and regret, where the other books exist much more in the immediate moment of the plot. Does this stem from any particular philosophy or approach you were working with? And Vandermeer says, now this is very interesting, I was working from the idea that, and this is in capitals, nothing will be the same ever again. I'm not a fan of things returning to status quo when it's clear they can't. That's a cheat on the part of the writer. It's saying, I'm going to take you out to the edge of the cliff and we're going to jump off the cliff, but halfway down there will be a net, and in the end, everything will be as it was before. That's ludicrous. That's not real life either. We survive things, we surmount them, but we're not the same as we were before, and thus the world isn't the same either. This isn't either depressing or upbeat. That's just how things are, and documenting that can be by measures harrowing, beautiful, uplifting, horrifying, and transcendent. We try, we keep trying, we can't go on, we go on. So that's the end of that. Now, another interview that's along similar lines is the Lightspeed interview. And Vandermeer is asked, you refer to the protagonist as the biologist. And that's because none of the characters in Annihilation have names or physical descriptions. Could you say why you decided to take that approach? Vandermeer says, and so we've got an in-universe answer for this as well as a narrative answer. Well, it's just purely a precaution on the part of the expedition. They've discovered over time that modern tech and using names are clear pathways for whatever the thing is that's in Area X to basically corrupt and eventually destroy the expeditions. So that really isn't a Kafkaesque kind of thing I'm doing there. That's something that's actually a practical application. But then that allows me, especially in the second and the third books, to kind of have some ruminations in there about what names mean and what functions names have. And the way that we draw a lot of information about characters and whatnot from their names, even though the name doesn't really convey anything about a person's character. The other thing you mentioned, the physical descriptions, that was because I felt it kind of was in line with the lack of names. It also created this interesting effect where they were totally defined by their actions and their dialogue and their interactions, first of all, which I think kind of had a clarity to it, at least while I was writing it. Secondly, it put them at a different remove from the landscape around them, and considering that nature is so important in the novels, I thought that was useful. So in a way, not giving them physical descriptions, but having physical descriptions of the things around them creates a different effect. Now, shifting topic to, let's call it genre. What sort of works are these novels and what is the trilogy itself? In famous writing routines, Vandermeer is asked, you have a wealth of experience as an author and editor with a focus on science fiction and fantasy. What inspired you to delve into these genres? And Vandermeer says, I'm not sure I really think of it that way. I started out as a poet writing poems that tended to be about nature, and when I branched out into short stories, there was always a mix of realism and the more surreal or hyperreal narratives. I founded a literary press and published poetry for quite a while. As I wrote more fiction, my fascination with the natural world became extrapolation that manifested in fantastical ways. This first appeared in my novel, Venice Underground, where I thought of biotech as something surreal as much as scientific, in the sense that people tend to use tech of any kind without knowing how it works or even the ethics behind it. So a Boschian phantasmagoria made sense in a place where biotech had become both horrific and beautifully independent. Then all of this meshed with a deep study of historical theory and eccentric historians, which culminated in my first major work, the Ambergris Trilogy. These are books that explore the titular imaginary city, but the twist in terms of their fantasy element, fantasy in quotes, is that there is none. Everything exists within the realm of the real, just not existing in our world. Most of the fantastical element comes from researching mushrooms and cephalopods and applying that to aspects of culture and history in the Ambergris books. So I guess what I'd say is I've always had a worldview where my writer's eye notices the strangeness, absurdity, and contradictions of the world around us. And this manifests in non-realist fiction for the most part. It's a mode that provides both the distance and the space for my imagination that works best for me. Lightspeed asks a really interesting question. So we've talked about fantasy and sci-fi at this point. Lightspeed says, I saw you wanted to write a, quote, supernatural novel without a supernatural element. Could you talk about that? So we come back to the Southern Reach. You have the Southern Reach Agency, which has become kind of degraded, like I said, over 30 years. And my thought was that, in a way, it's haunted. They're all haunted by this place that they're trying to explore. And so that was kind of like my guideline for what the mood and atmosphere of the novel was going to be. They were going to be haunted by something that wasn't supernatural, or they were going to be haunted by their memories and haunted by what they hadn't been able to accomplish. That was really part of what I set out to do. So I was thinking, what are the tropes of supernatural fiction? I went to, and this is going to be blasphemy, I know, but I really love Kubrick's The Shining and the specific effects he creates in that movie. There's some great stuff he does, like there's a TV in the center of the room with no cord coming out, and of course that's possible now, But it wasn't then. And there's all these little details he put there that really enhance the sense of unease because you can't quite identify or at first look why something is wrong. So I was like, well, that's an interesting technique. Like, for example, in The Shining, and this may be a continuity error, the pattern of the carpet is going one way in one scene, then in a later scene it's facing the other direction in the same hallway. That's an incredibly effective, almost kind of subliminal thing to do to somebody, to a viewer, in terms of making them feel like something is wrong, but not quite knowing what it is. So I thought, how can I translate some of these effects? And so that's what I did with Authority. It's also based on when I had a day job. I had a fair amount of interaction with government agencies. I was always fascinated by the fact that even in modern times, you would have agencies that would have DOS-based programs and databases and all kinds of mixes of technology, almost like when you go into a modern city and you see a 16th century cathedral next to a skyscraper. So I really also was interested in exploring that. I've also worked for some fairly dysfunctional companies. So I've had some experiences that I thought would be of interest. Authority has kind of a streak of dark humor running through it, especially, I think, if you've ever been in any of those kinds of situations in organizations. Electric Lit shifts our topic of genres a little bit more. In the introduction to the Weird Anthology and Vandermeer, and you observe that the weird often exists as a sensation within a narrative more than a specific genre of writing. Can you elaborate on this? So Vandermeer says there's a worldview that exists in the margins, one that partakes of the surreal and a bit of the realistic, one you might call Kafkaesque in one mode in which it's found. It's at times a tad absurdist and finds the world darkly absurd and tragicomic. That comes with a sense of strangeness, finds even in the mundane traces of the uncanny, whether through the elaborate rituals we let govern our lives or the abstract concepts, like money, that come to rule us. The human world is deeply weird. Weird fiction often riffs off of this, even if it shows the reader overtly some supernatural monster or other oddity. It's saying, in effect, I'm documenting something that doesn't exist, but I'm also telling you that the world around us is stranger than you think. That's why it can be a sensation within a narrative. It's imbuing the text with a viewpoint, immersing the text in that viewpoint, not just overlaying the peculiar in a plotted sense. It's all the way down into the substrate, the subtext. You can't really fake it. Then we get another interesting interview in Sci-Fi Site, and this is expanding the territory a little bit. As an author, critic, editor, you've long been a champion of a special kind of fantastic literature, stylish, surreal, opulent, grotesque, esoteric. How did your taste for this originally develop? What is the fundamental aesthetic of the fantasy you advocate and write? So, Vandermeer says, I had a surreal childhood growing up in the Fiji Islands, a tropical paradise balanced by being asthmatic and sometimes intense allergies and a dysfunctional family life. To my mind, beauty and horror or alienation were intertwined almost from the beginning. In Peru, once in bed on oxygen, very sick, I looked out my Cuzco hotel window set against a mountainside and saw two hummingbirds on the mating on the wing. It's at moments like that you begin to believe in visions. Ever since, I've looked for the surreal, sudden beauty in the service of liberty, wherever I can, because I believe these moments are the closest we can get to God or something spiritual. I don't believe in fantasy as fantasy at all, but as a kind of hidden reality pre-existing in our world. The fundamental aesthetic of the fiction I advocate and write is cross-pollination of forms, of genres, of techniques. I could think of no other way to produce beautiful mutants. In terms of the word fantasy, it's a combination of things, especially the lessons of practical surrealism, exemplified by one of my biggest influences, Angela Carter. Carter wedded surrealism to a coherent plotline, and she wrote like a raging inferno in human form. There are sentences in her novels and short stories that literally catch fire on the page when you read them. As for the other elements, they're difficult to articulate. Uniqueness of vision and the ability to articulate that vision in stylistically interesting ways, to be profane, to be transgressive. I admire Steve Eilert, for example, for stripping away much of the dross a writer accumulates in acquiring a style. There's a need sometimes, in a passionate desire for words not to be necessarily written. If only like music you could write in a way that conveyed itself directly to the reader's emotions and intellect without need of words. And although I'm answering this question in a somewhat roundabout way, I guess I want literature that takes the top of my head off, that exposes me to a mindset, a sensibility on some subconscious level, invests images with resonance, with meaning. This is perhaps a more sensible way of saying what I said before about Carter. The words actually seem to burn on the page, thematically or plot-wise. I'm not looking for any particular kind of fiction. So you see, it's the effect, what the author is able to do, rather than the genre they belong to, that Vandermeer is interested in. Coming back to the question of the weird, there's a long discussion in Book Riot. He's asked, I want to ask what weird fiction is, and also new weird is a term I've been seeing. Is that a different movement? Is that a subgroup? And Vandermeer says, well, I think that weird fiction is basically something that was defined by Lovecraft, but basically I think existed before that and has another thread, which is the Kafkaesque. And basically the idea is that unlike certain kinds of horror, the emphasis is not on the terror or the horror. The emphasis is on this beautiful unknown thing that may be monstrous, but that isn't automatically considered deadly or horrific, that may be even just by the narrator. The idea is also to divest oneself of tropes that have already come in with so many associations that when you write about them, those associations come in, like vampires. So a vampire story in general cannot be considered a weird story because it's not an unknown. It's a known you're kind of repurposing or renovating. And then new weird is just simply that around the early part of this century, there was a conversation being had mostly by British writers around the work of China Melville and M. John Harrison as to what do we call this impulse, which seems to have new wave influences, seems to incorporate things like Clive Barker's body horror, but is often set in secondary fantasy worlds. What is this movement? You know, it's partly genre. It's partly whatever, and someone put forth the term new weird, and it was a question, it was a discussion, in a sense solidified into a movement that some people don't think exists, but it keeps welling up whenever one of us who is involved in the initial conversation has a book that hits big or something. And then suddenly, for example, with Annihilation, suddenly I'm new weird again, as opposed to just a writer or a weird writer. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, new weird is kind of a category, but it's also led in some places, like in Eastern Europe, to editors being able to do whole marketing schemes. They call it new weird and publish stuff that's deeply strange they couldn't otherwise publish. And so it's had a very interesting effect. But it always makes me chuckle because it means so much and so little to so many people. He's asked then a follow-up. How do you go about writing weird? Is this something that chooses you with the story, or do you choose it and deliberately chase after it? And he says, well, I think there's writers who are just passing through who are agile enough that they change their style or voice depending on the nature of the story, and they write some pieces of weird fiction, but they also write other stuff. And then he says, I think for a lot of what you might call weird writers, especially historically, and doing the research for the Weird Anthology, I'd say this is true, they tended to be outsider artists. They tended to be basically living the thing they were writing about, even if it was strange and uncanny. They were, in some senses, seeing the world in an uncanny way. For me, I like it as a descriptor. If I have to be described as anything, simply because it is hard to turn it into a marketing term or category in a bookstore. And what I hate about the discussions about speculative fiction in particular, that they often become discussions about marketing and not the art and craft of it, because of the fact that there is that tradition of the pulps and everything and things coming from that commercial impulse. So when you have something like weird, I don't mind being called that because it's hard in the first place to define what that is, and I like that. I don't really like being pinned down because I do like to write a lot of different things. Then, shifting a little bit, now we're going to talk more about influences, and we've already gotten to some of the influences that we can see in the works. Lightspeed, there's a couple interesting questions that they ask in that interview. Are you a fan of horror writers who do workplace horror stuff? Does Thomas Ligotti do stuff like that? And Vandermeer says, yes, I adore Ligotti's workplace stories, which I believe are also based on personal experience. I think there's one called My Work Is Not Yet Done, and although I didn't really draw on that directly, I'm sure that was in the back of my mind a little bit. Those are great stories and well worth checking out. I think that's one of his great triumphs, actually, going from being someone who is supposedly so influenced by Lovecraft. He eventually moved out of that influence, moved on to other more interesting, I think, influences, but then managed to take some personal experiences or whatever and create some very modern horror of unease using that setting. Then he's asked, some people have suggested these books, the Southern Reach Trilogy, are influenced by Lovecraft. To what extent do you think that's true? And Vandermeer says something really interesting here. I understand in that Lovecraft is shorthand for talking about weird fiction to some degree. Where it bothers me is just that the approach to style is completely different and the approach to nature is completely different. I'm fairly convinced that Lovecraft could see the long shadow of a mouse on a wall and run screaming from the room, let alone be out in a wilderness area and enjoy. So his approach to nature, to me, it's not that separate from the old ones and stuff. That's all manifestations of it in a sense in his indifferent universe. And in Annihilation, you have nature which is just going along merrily in Area X and doing whatever it will, and whatever is also in effect there and subverting parts of nature and affecting the expeditions. In the Liberator magazine, he's also asked again, was the narrative of Annihilation created from a conglomeration of previously read horror fiction? The New Yorker compared you to Thoreau, but it definitely felt Lovecraftian to me. Did you always have a proclivity for the strange and inexplicable in literature? Vandermeer says, when I started writing short stories, I thought what I was writing was pretty normal and usual, but my friends always told me it was a little weird, a bit surreal and dreamlike, Kafkaesque. Since I often turned to extrapolation based on cutting-edge biological studies, including study of fungi and plant life, that effect often became magnified. I'm not a huge fan of Lovecraft, and especially not with regard to this trilogy, because I think the trilogy embodies the antithesis of what Lovecraft valued. More importantly, there's no aspect of the setting and events, not including the uncanny events, that isn't taken from first-hand observation, which means the biggest influences are autobiographical. Now, there is one other author lurking in the background, and many people have pointed this out, and in a Goodreads meeting of author and fans, we get a very interesting question. What role did J.G. Ballard's work play in your mind as you composed The Extraordinary Annihilation? And which work by J.G. Ballard? The Crystal World, of course, right? So Vandermeer says that's a great question. Some have suggested a direct influence through his disaster novels, but it's really more on the level of the craft of writing. Ballard was always amazing at manipulation of time and space. He would make you feel claustrophobic or as if you were in the midst of an expansiveness or vastness. He could compress time or expand it as well. He did this in a very specific ways through the way he wrote. Your brain always changed reading Ballard. So I studied those techniques over the years, and some of them I did bring to bear in Annihilation, and thanks for the compliment, being compared to J.G. Ballard. Now, coming back to Area X in Lightspeed, you mentioned Area X. Could you say a little bit more about what Area X is? What all of us want to know, including the characters in these books. So, Vandermeer says, basically some unexplained event, unexplained at least in book 1, has caused an area of very remote coastline to suddenly become kind of set apart from the rest of the world. And there's more about it in the second book, but there's actually kind of an invisible border with an access point that comes up around Area X. And over the last 30 years, the Southern Reach, the secret government agency, has been sending in expositions with various degrees of success, trying to figure out what's going on. So, good little summary there. As you find out in book 2, this had some really interesting effects on the secret agency itself, because you can imagine something that even with turnover personnel and whatnot is tried for 30 years unsuccessfully to solve a problem, you're going to have some devolution of command and control going on in that situation. In another interview, Book Munch, they ask, let's talk about Area X, an environmental disaster zone that swallowed up or in some way changed 11 previous expeditions. I was reminded of the Arctic space in which the movie The Thing occurs, even though Area X is not Arctic, stripping characters of names, creating an oblique space that has no direct ties to a recognizable place. Now notice the end of this question. How much fun is that for you? And so Vandermeer says, yeah, the Southern Reach has stripped the characters of names. I don't think it's giving too much away, since it's tucked away somewhere in Annihilation, to say that while there might be some Kafkaesque echoes by using the characters described by their function rather than their names, the truth is they found the expeditions sent in using names and using modern communication technology tend to end in disaster. Maybe it's something in the biochemistry of the mind or something even more sinister. But regardless of the reason, the lack of names does mean there's more focus on the characters' actions, interactions, and thoughts in terms of the biologist's narration. Combined with stripping down physical descriptions of characters, it reflects where the biologist's focus is. It's on the environment around her, of which the people are just a part. The other effect of doing this is that the descriptions of the natural world encroach on the characters more, since there's no buffer of words on the page in the form of names, in the form of character descriptions. Now, famous writing routines is going to ask, what was your creative process like in writing this series? And here we get to something really essential that we're going to talk about a bit more, especially connected with a particular term that comes up over and over again in a bit. Vandermeer says, the idea of place can be misunderstood in my fiction. Landscape and culture can impose their will on characters because of systems of colonization or oppression or bureaucracy gone wrong, but place itself isn't a character. It's always wedded to the character you're writing from the viewpoint of, which means the landscape is permeable and mutable. What I would see walking down the street, emphasize, notice, ignore, to use a crude example, is totally different, potentially, than someone else. But in some cases, you know the landscape better as the writer than in others, even within the series, because your character viewpoint. I wrote Annihilation, the first book, from a dream, because the path the expedition takes through Area X is a transformed 12-mile trail I hike out at the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. I know that trail so well, it's in my bones. And because the biologist shares a similar view of natural places in the non-human world, there was very little separation between what I would notice and what she would during the events in the novel. The difference came in the overlay of the events of her life versus those in mine, and how those shaped her, and how in some ways she was even more immersed in the natural world than I am. So at some point you're just following the trail, and the eruptions of the uncanny that occur may come from some other part of the brain, but they're all about the same experience of hiking. And he says, what I'm trying to convey is the sense of unfamiliarity exists in the real world, even if manifestations in the Southern Reach are the unreal accentuations of that. Each of the novels inhabits landscape and character in this way. So that was the baseline creative process. In Electric Lit, another interesting question about location. Reading the Southern Reach trilogy, I'm consistently struck by the way in which location becomes a thing, often hostile presence in your work. Certainly this is true of Area X, but the inscrutability of the Southern Reach building, the groupthink of its employees, also sets up a kind of hostile, self-driven setting. What role did this setting play in conceiving of this trilogy? Do you think of it as a character in the sense that it has mind and agency? And so Vandermeer says, well, there's several different answers to that question. One concerns the real world as we know it. Our environment contains much that's invisible to our senses, that permeates the landscape, that actually permeates us as well. Microbial life, parasites, creatures in symbiosis, things that live in the air. Plants, too, are communicating one to another, and insects through pheromones. There are lattice works and cathedrals of conversation that we're unable to hear. We have fairly primitive sensory data coming in on all of this, and this means we misunderstand our environment from the moment we're born. If we sometimes feel a prickle on the edge of our senses, it may be that some part of our reptile brain is experiencing a ghost of an echo of the complexity that truly surrounds us. So that's one answer. Another answer is that landscape in fiction always comes to us through the character viewpoints. One person has heard gunfire so much it doesn't really register in the same way that somebody living in a highway doesn't register the sounds of traffic at night. Well, another person does. Two people walk through a pristine wilderness. One notices the biting gnats and the mud and the ache in their knee. The other notices the night heron high on a branch and the way the pine forest transitions to swamp and a particular type of dragonfly. A third answer, specific to these novels, is that when dealing with an unknown, it's possible it may already be acting through these invisible interstices you cannot sense. And if so, then perhaps the landscape's already spying on you. It's worth noting that the biologist in Annihilation doesn't see the natural environment as threatening at all. The clearest sight is the kind that understands that even when we think we are removed from the natural world, that in fact we have never been and never will. Isn't that an interesting idea? And then our final interview, again from Clarke's World. When I was reading Annihilation, there was this point where I really felt like I couldn't trust anything that anybody said, including the narrator. I even started to wonder whether what she was telling was happening was authentic or not. Is that intentional? And Vandermeer says, yeah, it is intentional that this novel destabilizes you section by section. You think you're reading one kind of novel, then you think you're reading another kind of novel, then you slowly kind of descend into this world where you're having to yourself analyze what's going on and say, is this accurate, is this not accurate? You kind of descend into the paranoia because you get a sense, I think pretty early on, so it's not a spoiler, that the agency that's sending them in is pretty paranoid itself and hasn't told them anything like the excerpt that I read. You have that. Then you have whatever's in Area X being a really good mimic and at times throwing back things at you it thinks you want to see. If the biologist is inaccurate, it's because she's being misled. I think she's not so much an unreliable narrator as somebody who doesn't want to tell you everything at the time you want to hear it. Everything she says is accurate up to a point. It's just she's not telling everything. Especially in the third book, you learn a lot more about her too, and you get a better sense of maybe peculiarities of her character you don't know about in book one. And also by book three, a lot of the conversations that occur in Annihilation take on a different light because you know a lot more about those other characters in the expedition with her because some of the other two books go back into the past a little bit. There's a style in it, too, that I think you do, which is the characters hold back information. There's a follow-up question. In Authority, I noticed that sometimes I would think there would be an incident that will happen, and I will think it's all over with, and then a few pages later you come back, and you hear there was something really important that happened in that incident that wasn't explained at that time. What's your intention with that? And Vandermeer says, well, in part because the main character is trying to analyze everything and put it into context first, and it's also because the point at which some things happen to the main character isn't the point of maximum tension. It's when he has to report back to his superiors, but there's a real practical reason for some of those gaps, so I can't really address that. With a biologist, she's very concerned about being seen as objective and not being judged by certain things. So her agenda when she sets out this journal account, which is written, it's not really in the moment of what's happening, but a little bit afterwards, she's very concerned about that. And so there's certain things she doesn't want to let you know because she wants you to have other information first. I also think she's kind of a reticent person anyway, someone who kind of interacts with the wilderness a lot more than she does with other people or has more of an affinity. So, and that's where we are going to leave off. So we get a lot of really interesting reflections about what is going on in these three novels. What is the point? What is the genre? What was the reason for setting things up the way they are? And now we can look at some really important philosophical themes that we find brought up in these novels. One very interesting, complex, and rich philosophical theme that we've raised a little bit earlier is that whatever is there in Area X is in some way not just transforming, but communicating with the human beings that are part of our world and wind up being trapped in, but also, in a certain sense, escaping but not escaping Area X. And we see this with a number of different characters, some of whom we later, understand we thought they were monsters, but they're actually human beings in a different state. And so this is, articulated late in Annihilation, where the narrator says, imagine all these expeditions and then recognize that they all still exist in Area X in some form, even the ones that came back, especially the ones that came back layered over one another, communicating in whatever way is left to them. Imagine that this communication sometimes lends a sense of the uncanny to the landscape because of the narcissism of our human gaze, but that it is just part of the natural world here. I may never know what triggered the creation of the doppelgangers, but it may not matter. Imagine, too, that while the tower makes and remakes the world inside the border, it also slowly sends its emissaries across that border in ever greater numbers, so that in tangled gardens and fallow fields, its envoys begin their work. How does it travel and how far? What strange matter mixes and mingles? In some future moment, perhaps the infiltration will reach even a certain remote sheet of coastal rock, quietly germinate in those tidal pools I know so well. Unless, of course, I'm wrong, that Area X is rousing itself from slumber, changing, becoming different than it was before. The terrible thing, the thought I cannot dislodge here after all I've seen, is that I can no longer say with conviction that this is a bad thing, not when looking at the pristine nature of Area X and then the world beyond, which we have altered so much. Before she died, the psychologist said that I had changed, and I think she meant that I had changed sides. It isn't true. I don't even know if there are sides or what that might mean, but it could be true. I see now that I could be persuaded. A religious or superstitious person, someone who believed in angels or demons, might see it differently. Almost anyone else might see it differently, but I am not those people. I am just the biologist. I don't require any of this to have a deeper meaning. I'm aware that all this speculation is incomplete, inexact, inaccurate, useless. If I don't have real answers, it's because we still don't know what questions to ask. Our instruments are useless, our methodology broken, our motivations selfish. Now, isn't that some really interesting speculation and ideas? Again, not being preferred as, here's the answer to everything, but just raising possibilities that make some sense. So, what actually goes on in Area X, and what are these doppelgangers that are being talked about? So what we see, and we get two really important glimpses of this, one in Annihilation and then one later in Acceptance. The narrator, the biologist, is going to get infected, get affected by things. So she is looking at the inscriptions on the wall, which are a certain kind of fungi, perhaps, and she's seeing what's going on here in the tower, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later on. And we have this thing happen. I leaned in closer, like a fool, like someone who'd not had months of survival training or ever studied biology, someone tricked into thinking words should be read. I was unlucky, or was I lucky? Triggered by a disturbance in the flow of the air, and a nodule in the W chose that moment to burst open, and a tiny spray of golden spores spewed out. I pulled back, but I thought I'd felt something enter my nose, experienced a pinprick of escalation in the smell of rotting honey. Unnerved, I stepped back even further, borrowing some of the surveyor's best curses, but only in my head. My natural instinct was always for concealment. Already I was imagining the psychologist's reaction to my contamination if it was revealed to the group. Some kind of fungi, I said finally, taking a deep breath so I could control my voice. The letters are made from fruiting bodies. All right? And we're going to find out more about this. And we'll talk about that as another separate theme. We also, in Acceptance, find that the lighthouse keeper gets penetrated by a sliver. And that is going to affect him in some sort of way, right? And we're going to read about this as Gloria's mother, Trudy Jenkins, sees him, she's a doctor, about an hour before nightfall. And he says to her, I had this sliver. Another thing about Trudy was that he could talk about the sliver. He tried with Charlie, but for reasons he couldn't figure out, the more he talked about it with Charlie, the more he felt he was somehow putting it on Charlie, and he didn't know how much weight Charlie could take. And she says, you believe something bit you? Maybe not so much a bite as struck me. I had a glove on in my hand, but I still shouldn't have reached down. It might have not have anything to do with how I've been feeling. She nodded. I understand it's normal to worry with all the mosquito and tick-borne illnesses, so I can check your hand and arm and take your vitals and maybe put your fears to rest. And she is going to end up telling him, well, you know, I can't find any indication of anything abnormal on your arm or hand. Can't even find a mark, but if it's been a week, it could have faded. So, nothing? Relieved and glad he hadn't gone into Bleekersville, thinking about how much time off he had coming, how he'd prefer to spend it with Charlie. And she says, your blood pressure's elevated and you're running a slight fever, but that's all. Eat less salt, have more vegetables. See how you are in a few days. He felt better after he left. But as he headed back to the lighthouse, reviewing the checklist for the lens in his mind, the relief that had invigorated him had faded away and doubt crept in. Underlying everything was the thought he'd gone to the doctor as a kind of half measure for a larger problem, that he'd only confirmed there would be no easy diagnosis. This wasn't as simple as a tick bite or the flu. So they are going to be transformed. The biologist will describe this as a brightness. The lighthouse keeper will be even more transformed, as we're going to find out. So, and then there's the matter of the doppelgangers. So let's go on and read some more, beginning with Annihilation. So she is talking about her husband, who was on the previous expedition to Area X. And she says, how could I not be affected by Area X if only through him? One night, about a year after he'd headed for the border, as I lay alone in bed, I heard someone in the kitchen, armed with a baseball bat. I left the bedroom and turned on all the lights in the house. I found my husband next to the refrigerator, still dressed in his expedition clothes, drinking milk until it flowed down his chin and neck, eating leftovers furiously. I was speechless. I could only stare at him as if he were a mirage, and if I moved or said anything, he would dissipate into nothing or less than nothing. We sat in the living room. I needed some distance from this sudden apparition. He did not remember how we'd left Area X, did not remember the journey home at all. He had only the vaguest recollection of the expedition itself. There was an odd calm about him, punctured only by moments of remote panic when, in asking him what had happened, he recognized his amnesia was unnatural. Gone from him, too, seemed to be any memory of how our marriage had begun to disintegrate well before our arguments over his leaving for Area X. He contained within himself now the very distance he had in so many subtle and not so subtle ways accused me of in the past. She goes on and says, the man who had been a passionate recreational sailor and for 2 weeks out of the year went with friends to the coast to go boating, I could find none of that in him now. And I only had him in my life again for about 24 hours. They came for him the next evening, and once I went through the long, drawn-out process of receiving security clearance, I visited him in the observation facility right up to the end. That antiseptic place where they tested him and tried without success to break through his calm and amnesia. He would greet me like an old friend, an anchor of sorts to make sense of his existence, but not like a lover. I confess I went because I had hopes that there remained some spark of the man I'd once known, but I never really found it. Even the day I was told he'd been diagnosed with inoperable systemic cancer, my husband stared at me with a slightly puzzled expression on his face. He died 6 months later. During all that time, I could never get beyond the mask, never find the man I had known inside him. Not through my personal interactions with him, not eventually watching the interviews with him and the other members of the expedition, all of whom died of cancer as well. So these doppelgangers aren't completely, you could say, finished pieces, right? They're all dying of cancer. They all come back. And this is kind of strange, isn't it? Right. So we find out some other interesting things about what is going on with these people. And in Acceptance, the biologist, well, actually, let's talk about what happens with the biologist. So does she die? Is she disappeared? Anything like that? Well, let's talk a little bit more about her husband, right? So she makes him breakfast. She asks him what the journey was like, and he says effortless. How long did it take? No time at all. He asks her about her research, and she tells him that, but there's no real connection. A bit later on in the work, we're going to find that her husband, at one point is asking, "Where do you go at night?" And there's a vacant lot that has an ecosystem, a terroir, if you like, that we're going to talk about as a theme as well, that she is going off to. So that's going to prove important when we get to authority. Now, talking about what happens in Area X, we find that the brightness is slowly taking over the biologist. Soon after I stood once again on that trail, the brightness usurped many more places than just my nerve centers. I crumpled to the ground, cocooned in what felt like an encroaching winter of dark ice, the brightness spreading into a corona of brilliant blue light with a white core. It felt like cigarette burns as a kind of searing snow drifted down and infiltrated my skin. Soon I became so frozen, so utterly numb, trapped there on the trail in my own body, that my eyes became fixed on thick blades of grass in front of me, my mouth half open in the dirt. There should have been an awareness of comfort at being spared the pain of my wounds, but I was only being haunted in my delirium. I can remember only 3 moments from these hauntings. In the first, the surveyor, psychologist, and anthropologist, her expedition members, peered down at me through ripples as if I were a tadpole staring up through a pool of water. They kept staring for an abnormally long time. In the second, I sat beside the moaning creature, my hand on its head as I murmured something in a language I did not understand. In the third, I stared at a living map of the border, which had been depicted as if it were a great circular moat surrounding Area X. In that moat, vast sea creatures swam oblivious to me watching them. I could feel the absence of their regard like a terrible bereavement. A little bit later on, we get to see this, late night walk place, which is going to be important. She says, as habitats went, the lot wasn't complex, but its proximity dulled the impulse in me to just get in a car and start driving for the nearest wild place. I like to visit late at night because I might see a wary fox passing through or catch a sugar glider resting on a telephone pole. I didn't tell my husband my walk had a destination because I wanted to keep the lot for myself. There are so many things couples do from habit because they're expected to, and I didn't mind those rituals. Sometimes I even enjoyed them. But I needed to be selfish about that patch of urban wilderness. It expanded in my mind while I was at work, calmed me, gave me a series of miniature dramas to look forward to. So this is going to wind up being an important place where she's actually discovered when she returns as a doppelganger. And the question that we have to ask is it her? Right? So we find Control is talking to her and says, you're the double, the copy. Maybe the copy doesn't have the same defenses and you still don't know why. This much she told him. Test me, she said. Go ahead and test me. Say it, the words you think will destroy me. I don't want to destroy you, he said quietly, looking away. Are you sure, she said, coming very close. He could smell her sweat, see the rise of her shoulders, the half-curled left hand. Are you sure? Why not inoculate me if you're unsure? You already caught me between wanting me and not being sure, between being sure I'm human. Is that it? Made by the enemy, must be the enemy, but can't help yourself anyway. I helped you back at the Southern Reach, he said. Don't thank people for doing what they're supposed to. You told me that. So he says, I don't think you're with the enemy, and I don't think of you as a copy. Not really. And then she says, I am a copy, John, but not a perfect one. I'm not her. She's not me. Do you know what I'd say if I came face to face with her? Now, this is very interesting, and it raises a question that we're going to see come up later. What do you do if you encounter you? I'd tell her, you made a lot of fucking mistakes. You made a lot of mistakes, and yet I love you. You're a mess and a revelation, but I can't be any of that. All I can do is work out things myself. And then knowing her, she'd probably look at me funny and take a tissue sample from me, right? So we have this recognition of who one is, what one's self is, all right? And we get some interesting discussions. And this is actually from Acceptance. We should go back to authority, right, as well. And what we find is each of the people from the 12th expedition have come back as doppelgangers. Their appearance told them little. They'd been given the same generic uniform, vaguely army issue. Their heads had all been shaved. Their faces all retain the same expression, or could be said not to retain any expression. Don't think of them by their names, he told himself on the plane. Let them carry only the weight of their functions, then fill in the rest. The surveyor had been found at her house, sitting on a chair on the back patio. The anthropologist had been found by her husband, knocking on the back door of his medical practice. The biologist had been found in an overgrown lot several blocks from her house, staring at a crumbling brick wall. Just like the members of the prior expedition, none of them had any recollection of how they made their way back across the invisible border out of Area X. None of them knew how they'd evaded the blockades and fences and other impediments the military had thrown up around the border. None of them knew what happened to the fourth member of their expedition, the psychologist, who had in fact been the director of the Southern Reach and overridden all objections to lead them incognito. So, this vacant lot was the reemergence place. There's also a interesting discussion with the biologist, now renamed Ghostbird, and he says, "You're not the biologist." And she says, "You want the biologist. I'm not the biologist. Go talk to her, not me." Was this some kind of identity crisis or just metaphorical? And he says, "We can try again in the afternoon." And she says, "Try what? Do you think this is therapy? What for? What do you want from me? What do you really want?" Right? And she says, "I won't assist in charting my own pathology. I'm not the biologist." He says, "Whoever you are, we'll pick this up later." So what can you actually get from a doppelganger who recognizes that they're not a perfect copy of the person who they, are mimicking, an imitation of? So we find some very interesting things going on with them. And before we go back to Saul, the lighthouse keeper, let's talk about a few other important scenes that are taking place. So we find another discussion going on about midway through the work, and Grace is talking with Control, and Area X has expanded over its border, and he asked what happened to the people in the science division. They decided to barricade the basement, but that place was changing so fast they didn't stay long. And he asks, what about the director? So the director and Grace are good friends, lovers, they're connected together. And she says, "I put a bullet in its head as per prior orders. Once I determined that what had returned was an intruder, a copy, a fake. She could not continue or had thought of something that distracted her from the narrative or was just trying to hold it together. What did it cost her to kill even a version of the person she'd been so devoted to, could be said to have loved? Control couldn't even guess." So, not everybody has such a sanguine attitude towards copies. We get another interesting, not copy, but transmutation. Ghostbird, the copy of the biologist, says, "Did I find my husband? In a way, if not in the form in which I had known him, on the far side of the island in the late afternoon after I'd burst through the nettles and scrub and sticker, lacerating long grasses, all of it overshadowed by close-knit copses of wind-gnarled black pines, burst through to a tranquil cove that cupped a white sand beach and shallows that extended a fair distance beyond the darkness of deep water took over." Very nice description there. We read, on a single stunted pine, the height of a person stood defiant. On one outstretched branch, the unlikely silhouette of a common horned owl with sharp tufted ears, rust-brown face with white feathers at chin and throat, mottled gray and brown body. My loud approach should have alarmed it, but this owl just perched there, an unnatural scene to me, and it brought me up short. I thought at first the owl must be hurt. Any other owl would have taken wing. And I studied owls early in my career and knew that neuroses were unknown among them as opposed to other more intelligent bird species. And what does she eventually determine? The owl is actually her husband. And the owl, as we're going to find out reading later on, lives a very, very long life, right? There is a transformation of the lighthouse keeper that is similar to the transformation of the biologist. And we'll just read a little bit of it right now because we need to move on to some other philosophical themes. So this is towards the end of it where Saul is beginning to transform. So he's wondering what's going on. He thinks maybe that he's been given an experimental drug or exposed to radiation. And he begins to start seeing and hearing and thinking the words that are going to become another major theme here. And he feels a tidal pull and a vibration that went with the pull he's burning up. Or was the lighthouse burning up? And he says, this is a sharp light that knew its purpose. He could tell that already. But it was not the light from the lens. And he hesitated just below the lantern room for a moment. A light shone out from that space. A light that circled and curved, even as it had the discipline not to trickle across the floor. Right? His eyes adjusted, and the source of the light coalesced. A blossom. A pure white blossom with 8 petals, which had unfurled from the top of a familiar plant whose roots disappeared into the papers below, the plant that had enticed him on the lighthouse lawn so long ago to reach down, drawn by a glitter, a gleam. Right? And he eventually is going to regain consciousness. He finds that there are doppelgangers involved here as well. From the weird couple, right? And Saul, towards the end, we find is going to be stumbling around, and we'll finish up with this little passage here. Saul could go no further. He was done, and he knew it, and he wept as he fell. He felt the thing within him anchor him to the ground, as alien as any sensation he had ever felt, and yet as familiar as if it had happened 100 times before. It was just a tiny thing, a splinter, and yet it was as large as entire worlds, and he was never going to understand it, even as it took him over. His last thoughts before the thoughts that were not his, that were never going to be his. Perhaps there is no shame in this. Perhaps I can bear this, fight it, to give in but not give up, and projected back out behind him towards the sea. Saul, unable to say the name, just 3 simple words that seemed so inadequate, and yet they were all he had left to use. So we've got this very interesting transformation of human beings that has taken place. Is there any real deep explanation for it? Probably, but we just don't know what it is from these novels. Another very interesting theme that we're not going to work out quite so in detail as the previous one also has to do with communication, but in this case, language. And it has to do with the anomaly called the Tower, which is being explored early on in Annihilation, and with this creature who was at one time the lighthouse keeper, Saul, and is now the crawler. So what we find early on is that there are words running in a stream, and the words themselves, the letters, are made from what looked to a layperson like rich green fern-like moss, but in fact was probably a type of fungi or other eukaryotic organism. The curling filaments were all packed very close together and rising from the wall. A loamy smell came from the words, along with the underlying hint of rotting honey, which, by the way, is a smell that's going to be occurring in the southern reach as well later on. And so, the surveyor says, words made out of fungi? And the anthropologist says, there's no recorded human language that uses this method of writing. Is there any animal that communicates this way? I had to laugh. No, there's no animal that communicates in this way, right? And so it's fruiting bodies forming words. A little bit later on in this, we see the biologist saying, what did I know? What were the specific details? An organism was writing living words along the interior walls of the tower and may have been doing so for a very long time. Whole ecosystems had been born and now flourished among the words dependent on them before dying off as the words faded. But this was a side effect of creating the right conditions, a viable habitat. It was important only in that the adaptations of the creatures living in the words could tell me something about the tower. For example, the spores that I had inhaled, which pointed to a truthful seeing. I was brought up short by this idea. The wind-lashed marsh reeds, a wide blurred ripple all around me. I'd assumed the psychologist had hypnotized me into seeing the tower as a physical construction, not a biological entity, and that the effect of the spores had made me resistant to this hypnotic suggestion. But what if the process had been more complex? What if, by whatever means, the tower emanated an effect to one that constituted a kind of defensive mimicry, and the spores had made me immune to that illusion? I had several questions and few answers. What role did the crawler serve? What was the purpose of the physical recitation of the words? Did the actual words matter, or would any words do? Where did the words come from? What was the interplay between the words and the tower creature? Put another way, were the words a form of semiotic or a parasitic communication between the crawler and the tower? Either the crawler was an emissary of the tower, or the crawler had originally existed independent from it and come into its orbit later. Which brought me back to the words. And we'll actually look at these words as they come up in discussions in authority. So these words have been, at least to some degree, preserved, right? And control is finding these on a wall. And here's how it runs. Where lies the strangling fruit that came from the hand of the sinner? I shall bring forth the seeds of the dead to share with the worms that gather in the darkness and surround the world with the power of their lives, while from the dim-lit halls of other places forms that could never be writhe for the impatience of the few who have never seen or been seen. In the black water with the sun shining at midnight, those fruits shall come ripe, and in the darkness of that which is golden shall split open to reveal the revelation of the fatal softness in the earth. The shadows of the abyss are like the petals of a monstrous flower that shall blossom within the skull and expand the mind beyond what any man can bear. On and on it went, so that Control had the impression that if the director hadn't run out of space, she wouldn't have run out of words either. And so the question is, well, what do these actually mean? What is the purpose of it? And Grace says, the director wrote this. These are the words found written on the walls of the tunnel. And they're asking, well, what does it mean? And Whitby says, well, that's why we brought the linguist, Shu, a short, slender woman with long black hair. And she says, first of all, we're 99.9% certain this text is by the lighthouse keeper Saul Evans. Why? Well, because it matches his syntax and word choice in a few of his sermons we have on audio tape, right? So that tracks, and perhaps there's no greater meaning to it. But then we find out from Shu, who says, here we go, that's superstition. That's complete and utter superstition. You shouldn't say that. And what is she responding to? Whitby saying, we don't like to reproduce the words because we still don't know exactly what triggered the creation of area X or Y, right? So Shu doesn't participate in this superstition, vehemently did not, practicing a lax sort of Christian faith which brought with it inexplicable elements and phantasmagoria all its own. But he agreed with her assessment, even if that antipathy might be leaking into her analysis. Grace stops her and says, it's not superstition. And then she says, it is superstition, but it might be true. Now, here's where we get a really interesting set of reflections. How could a superstition be true? Control pondered that later as he turned his attention to his trip to the border, along with a cursory look at a file Whitby had pulled for him titled simply Theories. Maybe superstition was what snuck into the gaps, the cracks, when you worked in a place with failing morale and depleted resources. Maybe superstition was what happened when your director went missing and the assistant director was still mourning the loss. Maybe that was when you fell back on spells and rituals, the reptile brain saying to the lot of you, I'll take it from here. You had your shot. It wasn't even unreasonable, really. But not everyone believed in the same versions. The linguists still believed in the superstition of logic, for example. So, perhaps there's other superstitions going on. And what we find is these words are, in a certain respect, a kind of red herring. They don't communicate. What communicates more is what is actually happening with the people and to the people in Area X. The last philosophical theme that we're going to have time to address, because this is already getting quite long, is that of terroir, which is not a philosophical term, but rather one that has to do, on the one hand, with ecology, and on the other hand, with gastronomy and wine production. So one of the characters, Whitby, is bringing up a really interesting idea and has turned it into a document. And we're going to find out, this is in Acceptance, that Whitby has been developing what he calls a combined theories document, a thesis on terroir, evoking a comprehensive ecosystem approach based on an advanced theory of wine production. And this is going to play a little bit of a role. We find that the control person is going to bring this document along. He examines his rescued Whitby pages, the terroir pages, and he's going to use them to try to get through to Ghostbird. And why so? Because the biologist, without calling it terroir, is very interested in these comprehensive ecosystems. So the main place to go to for understanding this is in Authority, about halfway through. And it's kind of funny because there's a play on words that's going on. The control person has been mishearing Whitby saying terror when Whitby's actually been saying terroir. And he says, well, what is terroir then? Whitby says, a wine term. And he says, and it gets very animated. Well, what does that mean? What doesn't it mean? Whitby said. It means the specific characteristics of a place, the geography, geology, and climate that, in concert with the vine's own genetic propensities, can create a startlingly deep original vintage. Now Control was both confused and amused. How does this apply to our work? In all ways, Whitby said. His enthusiasm doubled, if anything. Terroir's direct translation is a sense of place. And what it means is the sum of effects of a localized environment inasmuch as they impact the qualities of a particular product. Yes, that can mean wine, but what if you applied these criteria to thinking about Area X? On the cusp of catching Whitby's excitement, Control said, so you mean you would study everything about the history, natural and human, of that stretch of coast in addition to all other elements, and you just might find an answer in that confluence? Next to the ideas of terroir, the theories that had been presented to Control seemed garish and blunt. Exactly. The point of terroir is that no two areas are the same. No two wines can be exactly the same because no combination of elements can be exactly the same. Certain varietals cannot occur in certain places, but it requires a deep understanding of a region to reach conclusions. And this isn't being done already? Whitby shrugged. Some of it, just not all of it considered together, in my opinion. I feel there is an overemphasis on the lighthouse, the tower, base camp, those discrete elements that could be said to jet out of the landscape, while the landscape itself is largely ignored, as is the idea that Area X could have formed nowhere else, although that theory would be highly speculative and perhaps based mostly on my own observations. Control nodded, unable to shake a sturdy skepticism. Would terroir really be more useful than another approach? If something far beyond the experience of human beings had decided to embark upon a purpose that it did not intend to allow humans to recognize or understand, terroir would simply be a kind of autopsy, a kind of admission of the limitations of human systems. You could map the entirety of a process, or say a beachhead or an invasion, only after it happened, and still not know the who or the why. He wanted to say to Whitby, growing grapes is simpler than Area X, but refrained. And, we read a little bit further. Grand unified theories could backfire. For example, Central's overemphasis on trying to force connections between unconnected right-wing militia groups. Recalled that his father had made up stories about how one piece in his ragtag sculpture garden commented on that one and how they are part of a larger narrative. But maybe this terroir idea has some legs to it, right? How did you factor ghosts into any terroir? Did they deepen the flavor? Did they make things dry, chalky, irreconcilable? So this notion of terroir, I think, is actually sort of a leading clue into how to understand these novels and what is going on within them. The biologist is somebody who can, without using the term terroir, think in those terms. And so this is where we're going to end with our examination of these three great, closely connected Southern Reach novels in this trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer.